Good to record, Sarah? Oh, great, thank you. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. My name is Dr. Ashley McClure, and I'm a physician in Oakland, and this important conversation is hosted by Climate Health Now. We're really glad you're here. Although we are meeting virtually, we're all connected by the air we breathe and our concern for the state of California and what that means for our children's future. Importantly, in this conversation this morning, there are many voices that are not represented, and also in the task force. And I think we're really hoping that the seeds and the connections that we make today in this conversation will help to bring all voices to the table, not only in the task force, but in all seats of power. So just a little background, in April, the governor appointed a task force on business, jobs, and jobs recovery. And the goal of that is to craft ideas for short, medium, and long-term solutions that reflect communities across the state and emphasize a fair and equitable recovery from COVID. The task force will not only focus on our immediate recovery, but on actions to support a cleaner, more equitable, and prosperous future for Californians. The governor appointed business, civic, and climate leader, Tom Steyer, who we're thrilled to have with us today, as chief advisor to this task force. And this incredible group of leaders has an historic opportunity before them for building back better. And today's discussion will be about how to help the task force to make climate, health, and equity the central priorities of California's economic recovery from COVID. So here in the Climate Health Now community, we really see this through three different lenses and how that can inform our recovery. The climate lens we see visualized with proposals that many might be familiar with, like the green stimulus or the vision for equitable climate action, to take advantage of our COVID recovery and all the capital investments with that to catalyze the clean energy transition that we desperately need to start. We see the health lens as being really the US call to action on climate, health, and equity, which Dr. Rudolph was an enormous lead on, and we'll talk more about. But the US call to action on climate, health, and equity is a policy action agenda with support from over 150 US medical organizations, representing millions of health professionals who all share the recognition that climate change is a public health emergency, even greater than COVID, which Dr. Rudolph will talk about. And it urges civic and business leaders and government officials to work together to find solutions to protect health. And finally, maybe most heavy in our hearts right now, we also see the recovery through the lens of equity and justice. And these are kind of the principles of this are articulated in the 5 principles of the just recovery. And importantly, the first principle of the just recovery principles is that health is the top priority for all people with no exceptions. So we couldn't be more honored to have our guest today, and thank you so much for joining. We're really excited for the conversation and to learn from how it unfolds. I'll turn it over to Amanda.
Hi everyone, I'm Amanda Milstein. I'm a co-founder of Climate Health Now and a nutrition and research. If everyone could mute themselves, that would be really helpful. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to both of our speakers today. It goes without saying that this is a very pared down biography for both Dr. Rudolph and Tom, whose lists of accomplishments are very long. Tom Steyer, who we are exceedingly excited to welcome today, left his successful investing business 7 years ago to give all of his money and time and energy to fighting for progressive causes. He has since gone on to lead a number of people-first grassroots campaigns that have focused on issues like clean air, healthcare costs, and public education. Most recently, Tom was a former Democratic presidential candidate, and he now serves as co-chair with Governor Newsom for Governor Newsom's Business and Jobs Recovery Task Force. Dr. Linda Rudolph is a public health physician and former public health director for the city of Berkeley. She currently advises the Public Health Institute and the Medical Consortium on Climate and Health. She serves on the National Board of Physicians for Social Responsibility and is also on the steering committee for Climate Plan California. Linda previously served as Deputy Director for Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Promotion at the California Department of Public Health, where she was a founding chair of California's Health in All Policies Task Force. We also just wanted to let everyone know that we will be fielding questions throughout the conversation, so please feel free to post questions in the chat throughout. Alrighty, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
Thank you very much. Let me say, my understanding is this will be a conversation, and that's exactly what I want it to be. That's what I want to hear from you, what you understand and learn from your experience and expertise. I'm happy to share what little experience and expertise I have. Let me just describe for you how I approached climate 10 years ago in the No on 23 campaign, because it really is pretty consistent with the way that I think about it now and the values that I think Climate Health Now represents. In 2010, 2 oil companies tried to get rid of California's progressive climate laws. And nobody wanted to fight them because people thought oil companies always win. I co-chaired the campaign against them with George Shultz, and we ran a completely different campaign from a traditional environmental campaign. We said we're going to have a different argument. Our argument will be jobs and health. We will have an argument that is people-centered around the interests of the people of California. And when we talk about health, what we're talking about is environmental justice. We're talking about clean air and clean water for underserved Black and brown communities where the asthma rates are astronomical and where you can't drink the water. We said we will not be talking specifically about scientific issues or polar bears, because that is actually not how the lens through which people see climate. We will be talking about health and jobs exclusively. That means we'll have a different coalition. We're going to have a coalition that starts in the communities where health as a result of pollution is a voting issue, where families understand what it means for their kids to be sick, understands what it is for them to be sick, understands the threats to their ability to go to work, go to school, live a normal life. That coalition, which was a justice-based coalition, actually put us in the right place in terms of argument, moral high ground, and actually winning. We got 70% of the vote in a fight where people were expecting us to lose. And so everything that I've done since then has been based on those principles, which is climate has to be interpreted through a human lens so people can understand for themselves why it's important to them, their family, and their community. When I ran for president, I talked a lot about climate. And our climate plan was described as a justice-based climate plan. That was actually the title. Because what we were arguing was, we know who lives in Flint, Michigan. I've been to Flint, Michigan. I know who lives in the San Joaquin Valley and can't drink the water that comes out of the tap. I've been to Denmark, South Carolina, where they have a huge water issue in terms of safety. And I know where the asthma centers are in the state of California. So what I'm here to talk about and to listen to you is exactly what it means to put climate in the context of health and jobs. This is also our task force has specifically in a 3-sentence mission statement talks about equity and justice, specifically economic justice, racial justice, and environmental justice in 2 of the 3 sentences. And it also talks about sustainability and resilience. We have to build a different California than we came into 2020 with. And we're going through a huge health crisis. We're going through a huge economic crisis. But out of that, we have to come to a new and better place with justice at its center. That's what this task force has been tasked to do. And every decision we make puts those underserved Black and brown communities at the forefront of our policy recommendations to the governor. And this is exactly what Governor Newsom asked us to do. It's what we've agreed to do. We had principles of equity before the murder of George Floyd. and I've been working, you know, it is impossible for me, in my mind, to separate justice, sustainability, and equity. So that's what I had to say to start the conversation, but I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks so much, Tom. And again, thank you for being here. We all really appreciate all of the work that you've done to address climate change, corporate power, voting as a key foundation for democracy. I was going to start by sharing a little bit about why health professionals wanted to speak with you, but you actually said a lot of what I was going to say. So I'll shorten my preface here. But as health professionals here in California, across the US, around the world, we really do see the climate crisis as our single greatest health challenge of the century, even in the face of the COVID pandemic. We see it as an existential threat to human survival. And like you, we see the climate crisis set against a backdrop of racism and economic inequality and power imbalances that have caused the unhealthy living conditions that you mentioned in Flint and the Central Valley and so on, especially for low-income communities and communities of color. We also see the climate crisis as perhaps the greatest health opportunity of the century, because we think that if we really make the transformational changes in our energy and agriculture and building and land use systems that we need to take on the climate crisis, we will also yield huge health and health equity benefits. But we'll only do that if we structure our climate solutions in the right way and really think about health and equity in every step of the process. So when the governor set up the task force and appointed you as the co-chair, with an emphasis on ensuring the health of every Californian and a fair and green recovery, we were super excited. But I have to say that when we look at the makeup of the task force, we're concerned because we see two really big gaps. And so I want to hear from you how you're addressing those gaps. One is that we're not seeing public health experts on the task force. We see a lot of fantastic healthcare experts, but we're not seeing the public health experts that really are trying to address these structural and social determinants of health and working in these communities every day. And of course, we're in the middle of a public health crisis. So that's a curious omission. And the second is people that are really working in and for and with the most impacted communities, the communities that have been most impacted by COVID, but those communities are also disproportionately impacted by the health impacts of climate change. So my questions are, how are you ensuring that those critically important community and public health voices are actually at the table in the task force? And second, I'll leave my second part of the question for a moment.
Okay. So let me address both of those questions. The easier one, Linda, the first one, I'm going to answer the second one first, which was about the people representing the most impacted communities. First of all, we do have community activists on this task force. One of the people who has taken a leading role is Angela Glover Blackwell, who started Policy Link out of Oakland, and who has been one of the co-chairs of the subcommittee on equity, and has been, and there are other people, Manuel Pastor, who's a professor down at USC, who has worked on equity issues for his entire career. So I do think that voice is being heard internally very consistently and very loudly. In every subcommittee that we have, of which we have 10, there is somebody who is specifically tasked to make sure that every policy recommendation we make to the governor has equity and justice, at the forefront of our thinking. So when we think about, if we're thinking about the digital divide, we are asking equity and justice questions at every single point. if we're thinking about, small business, we're thinking about it from the standpoint of equity and justice. So and the other thing I'd say is this: we are also reaching out to people outside this task force to talk. I have been speaking to people personally in the environmental justice community throughout this whole time to talk to them about what their issues are and to make sure that they're reflected in the thinking that's going on. So on that one, I actually feel as if we've gone, that really has been a central tenet of every discussion we have. It really has. I also think, to be fair, we have 15 people on this task force who are labor union leaders, who view themselves, just so you know, as social justice people. They view them, Mary Kay Henry is the head of the SEIU, and she's someone I've known and worked with for a long time. She definitely sees herself as representing some of the most vulnerable working people in our society. So that one, I think, in a variety of ways, that really is central to the job the governor's asked us to do, and central to every discussion, literally. I can say that fairly. In terms of the public health question, and I know I'm speaking to health professionals here, so I may be, it may be that there's something that you're bringing up that I didn't understand. We have a lot of people from the health world. And, I think you were drawing a distinction between public health and people running big health systems.
Correct.
Yes. We have a couple of people who I think are from the public health world who work in that space. We also have people running some of the big hospital chains, I think is, Kaiser and Sutter Health, and people in the nonprofit world who are dealing with health issues. So it's possible that that's a place where we're looking at health from a particular angle and not including everything, but we do have people from the public health space, but maybe not in the way that you're meaning. So I'd love to hear what the distinction is, Linda.
I appreciate that, and maybe we can actually have a separate conversation about why we think that public health expertise is so important, and it is distinct from healthcare expertise. And we certainly public, the health sector works together across all of our different components, but it is the public health infrastructure that in fact is on the front lines every day in these communities, really addressing the social determinants of health and the structural determinants of health, and trying to focus from a prevention lens,
right,
more than a response lens. So I think that it's also important because I love that you're talking about incorporating the health and justice frame in all of the considerations of the task force. I'm sort of interested in how you're doing that, and whether there's sort of a process or a mechanism or a set of questions that you're asking to really put a climate lens, a health lens, an equity lens on each of the recommendations that are coming forward to the task force.
Well, let me make one quick point, and then I'm going to answer your question about how we do it. Just writing myself a note here to make sure. One thing I should say is we are about jobs and employment recovery. And so, whereas this is obviously a crisis that is about the interaction of health and economics and employment, we are specifically tasked with advising the governor on the business recovery. And he has other people who are really the people who are advising him, who are the health, the Dr. Mark Galleys of the world, who are giving specific health advice about, what to do on the specific health crisis. And I understand that the two are deeply intertwined, but just to be clear, our task is specifically to try and make sure that we come out in a healthy way for sure, but an equitable, just, sustainable, and resilient. And how do we do that? It is in our mission statement, and I'm a huge believer in mission statements because I believe when you're in a tough question, you go to your mission statement to ask what you're trying to do. We also have principles of equity and principles of sustainability that we wrote out not in response to the unrest around the murder of George Floyd, but from the very get-go to say every decision has to incorporate this way of thinking. As I said, in every subcommittee, someone is tasked to make sure that that way of thinking is specifically followed. But I think the other thing, the realistic way that this is true is the people on this task force include people for whom that is their life work, like Angela Glover Blackwell. And so every conversation includes at its heart a question about, we know who's disproportionately suffering in terms of COVID. We know who's likely to have been laid off. We know the communities where there are really high asthma rates, and we know the places that it's unsafe to drink the water, and we know they're all the same communities. And so when we think about a policy to move forward, it literally, every one of them includes the idea of how are we going to address equity and justice. That is really something the governor asked us to do, but I think that it's in the makeup of the committee. I think it's in the mission statement. I think we have literally written out principles that we've circulated and accepted. And I think that I can tell you in every single conversation, when we talk about small business, there's a question about, okay, how is this specifically affecting African-American businesses? How is this affecting Latino businesses? How is this affecting the smallest businesses? What are we doing to make sure that they are not, there are strong structural elements disadvantaging them. What are we doing to support them so they can get through this crisis?
That's great to hear. It would be great if the task force could actually post the principles.
I think we have, but honestly, I think they're public.
Okay.
Because they've been quoted. I'm not sure. I know the principles of equity are, and we actually, we did this at the very get-go, but we also put out a letter talking about equity and justice subsequent to the protests, to say how we viewed it and why we thought those protests were appropriate and what we were. So, and I can send both of those to you, because we did that specifically to say, this is a very diverse group of Californians in terms of background and in terms of expertise and experience. And we are coming together with a value system that we think reflects California's traditional values. And they're progressive, and they're exactly the kind of thing that I think reflects this administration and this governor. But I think they also project in the future what it is we're trying to accomplish.
Great. So with that backdrop, let's talk about some of the specific questions that people in the audience have about things that the task force may have already considered or that we would like them to consider. We have quite a few comments on how, if nothing else, I mean, I know there's a lot of public health people on the call, and I have never felt prouder to be a local and state health department person over my career. And I really appreciate that the public health people are doing what they're doing to save lives against tremendous challenges. But COVID has really demonstrated that our public health infrastructure, particularly local health departments, has really been frayed by years of neglect and defunding. And we don't have the kind of public health workforce that we need. We see that now in terms of how local health departments are struggling to get the kind of, trained community health workers. We need an army of them to do contact tracing. But with the climate crisis, we need that same army of community health workers to really be helping particularly the most impacted communities build climate resilience. So I'm wondering what the task force can do to help us build capacity in impacted communities through, for example, a community health corps. Is that sort of within scope?
Well, let me say this again. This task force is really about jobs and employment and economic recovery. So when you talk about contact tracing, that is obviously something that the governor is trying to build, that they are talking about hiring, I mean, I've heard him say 10,000 contact tracers. They're also talking about a technological solution in a way that people can do it through their phones. And those solutions are really outside the scope of this task force. What we can do is make it possible to get those people employed, to figure out ways how to find people, and specifically to go into those underserved Black and brown communities when we start talking about employment, about how exactly do we reach out and make sure that that the people who are getting these jobs are people who are in the most impacted communities, and how these jobs are not just a one-time, short-time hit, but actually can be something that leads into something broader, longer, and more meaningful to their lives.
That's really important, because we need that public health workforce capacity in these communities and from these communities. So anything that the task force can do to really create a pathway toward a workforce that's built around community health promotion and climate resilience would be terrific.
So, and that is something where, look, we are really, really serious. You were asking me, how do we think about equity and justice in terms of this task force? When we're talking about ways to rebuild employment, we are talking about ways, yes, we need to make sure that the job growth exists. But then the other question is, how are we going to target this to the people who otherwise wouldn't be part of it? How are we going to reach out to them and recruit them and train them and make it possible for that to happen in the real world? And those are questions that we are addressing. You know, let me give you another example that I think does relate to health, I think does relate to equity and justice, and that is the need to have every family hooked up to high-speed internet. You know, the number of people who are doing their doctor's appointments virtually has skyrocketed. And the ability to participate in so-called telehealth is something that seems like every family needs in California. So when we think about how that's going to happen, to me, it's a health issue. I mean, I think it's also a justice and equity issue.
Right.
It goes to health, but it goes beyond health, because it also goes to education and training. When we're talking about the different ways to reach people, the simplest way to reach people these days is virtually. But if you're not hooked up to high-speed internet, you can't participate in that part of our society and our economy and our health system and our education system. So when we're thinking in this task force about all those questions, at the forefront of our minds is the families and the communities who aren't able to participate, and what can we do to actually enable their participation and bring them to some of the possibilities and opportunities of the 21st century in California.
So you obviously care very, very deeply and passionately about climate change, and that's why this group is here, is because we see this climate, health, equity, justice, interconnectivity. There's some tension around some views that California needs the oil industry, particularly in places like Kern County, and our view that we should be moving as quickly and as justly as we can away from fossil fuel extraction. And I'm wondering what your view is about what the task force can do to help us move past the myth that it's bad for California's economy to stop sucking oil out of the ground, and instead toward focusing on jobs in oil well remediation for all of the communities that are impacted by oil and gas extraction, in making sure that California's economy isn't subject through our continued investments in fossil fuel infrastructure and fossil fuel companies to the vagaries of the oil market, in really using whatever dollars we can find for recovery. And I know you're tasked with finding things that don't cost a lot of money, but really taking advantage of the current problems in the oil market to build out our renewable energy infrastructure, which will create jobs, especially if we pay attention to things like microgrids and, community energy sustainability and retrofitting and weatherization in low-income communities, and building community resilience hubs that will provide clean air and cooling, because the same communities that are seeing COVID now are now going to experience wildfire smoke and all of the, with its particulate matter that increases COVID death, and they're going to be experiencing extreme heat. So we see a whole host of jobs that will also improve and promote community health and climate resilience and move us away from fossil fuel extraction. So
Linda, let me go back to my opening statement. I said in 2010, in No on 23, that this campaign is going to be around the health of the people of California and clean energy jobs for the people of California. That's our future. And, every single thing you said, I personally worked with the activists down in Oxnard to stop the Puente plant, which I think had been basically approved and which we did together stop, which I hope is the last fossil fuel plant ever proposed in California.
Well, we're still approving new.
I'm aware.
Oh, well, so we want to put in a plug for your using your position right now.
I know.
Governor, that has to stop.
Look, I have also said there is no reason for us to build more fossil fuel infrastructure ever. Let me put this in my perspective. Look, this task force specifically in its mission statement talks about clean energy, sustainability, and resilience. All the things you're talking about. And, I have, in the context of the last decade, I have been arguing we will create multiples of the jobs in moving to a clean economy that we will in this fossil fuel economy, that will create multiples of union jobs, multiples of every kind of, of just absolute jobs, multiples in what we have to do because we have to rebuild this state and this country. So there is no doubt in my mind that we should not be spending more money on fossil fuels. And let me say one other thing.
Will the task force say that as well as you?
Yeah, look, the task force is committed and the governor is committed to sustainability, clean energy. I mean, that is in our mission statement. We have principles of sustainability and clean energy publicly, not because we're responding to any pressure, because there, in effect, hasn't been a real public outcry about this, but just because that's what we care about and we want to make it public. But the other thing I want to say is this, Linda, which I have been hearing very recently and directly relates to, look, we're going to this clean energy economy. The question is the speed. The question is how fast, is there a delay? What emphasis and priority do we put on it?
Can I ask a question?
And this is a critical point. You guys have said climate is the number one public health issue for people in this state, this country, and this world. Yeah. Yes. This is, when you talk about a quote unquote existential question. I mean, I know that's a long word, but I also know I'm talking to a lot of people with advanced degrees. So a lot of long words. But this is a life or death question for people on this planet.
Yeah. So Ashley, I'm going to just keep going if you don't mind. I want to switch gears, Tom, because you just talked about this is an issue that, far exceeds California. So I want to switch gears, and you've obviously, you're a politician as well as all the other things that you are. You've done a lot of election work. We feel frustrated in the health community nationally that although you understand the connections between climate and health, that for the most part, we don't hear our candidates
talking in those terms.
Climate and the climate crisis as a health crisis. And for us, we see that as this huge missed opportunity, especially when people are so focused on health and on racial justice, And there is this incredible nexus. So what can we as a community do to amplify that message to the American people in the context of the elections? Because this election, it's a make or break election for the future of our country. And we believe that this nexus is one that is actually a winning message for candidates.
So, I mean, obviously you're bringing up something that I've spent years working on.
Correct.
And the way that and let me say this, the way that I think that public health is being discussed in terms of climate is through the lens of environmental justice. Because I think that environmental justice is about health. It's not about all of the health issues that I know that the people on this call are concerned with, but it is about clean air and clean water. And it is specifically talking about the health of underserved Black and brown communities. And I can tell you that that message, the environmental justice message, which is something we were talking about 10 years ago as being the cornerstone for morality in terms of changing climate policies and energy policies. And that basically, if you get environmental justice right, if you have those communities in the forefront in terms of making policy, you will solve the climate crisis along with the health crisis. That lens, I promise you, has suddenly, maybe as a result of the unrest around structural racial injustice, has really moved up into the forefront of politicians around this country. And I've heard them start to use the language that we were using 10 years ago in terms of talking about climate and talking about the coalition around climate. And that is, you know, leading national politicians. And let me say one last thing. I have been working with the Biden campaign around climate, around environmental justice, around youth organizing, which I see as one connected political question. And I honestly think the vice president has been doing if you get a chance, has been doing a very good job of explaining this in the context of public health, environmental justice, and jobs for working people who, you know, including what I don't particularly love the phrase just transition, which just means you take care of working people in industries that are going to decline. You make sure that that's a real issue for them, that you take that seriously and take it on and make commitments to the idea, not just that there are going to be jobs, but that we are going to make sure that you specifically are taken care of if the industry you're in, through no fault of yours, declines.
So you have, you know, 100 or more than 100 people on the phone call that are health professionals that care about climate and health and justice. And we have a network of people like us around the country, including in all of the swing states. What would you say are the most important things we can do other than giving money to really amplify this message in the context of the election? What's the best way for health organizations to work, for example, with Climate Power 2020 that I know you're involved in, or other organizations, especially because most of our organizations are 501c3?
Right. Well, let me say, I don't know about the organizations, because as a C3 organization, I'm not, you know, most of the stuff that I do is overtly political and not tax deductible. So honestly, so I'm not sure. I know that there's certain things that C3 organizations can do, like registering people regardless of party affiliation and putting out public information. But I do think that the people on medical professionals have an amazing voice in our communities in our country. People trust medical professionals as people with a lot of brains, but also a lot of morality. And as you said, this election, I mean, politicians say this all the time, and I know that. I don't think this is the biggest election of our lifetime. this could be the biggest election in the history of the world. If you really follow the climate, what happens in the next 5 years is going to put us on a different trajectory one way or the other. And, the United States, described as the essential country, we can't do this by ourselves, but it can't be done without leadership coming from America. And this is a global problem. I think the voice of the people on this call and other public health and health officials is something that has amazing resonance in your communities. And the question is, how much do you want to put yourself on the line for this? And, I basically stopped doing what I was doing 8 years ago to basically say, I don't understand how we don't commit to changing our trajectory, because this is a disastrous trajectory. We are on a trajectory to destruction. And therefore, I felt like I just want to be one of the people, and I'm sure the other people on this phone call feel exactly the same way. I want to be one of the people getting us off this trajectory, because this trajectory ends in despair and death. And that's exactly where we are. We're going to make a dramatic change on November 3rd. I personally believe that's going to be to a much more progressive America. But we're going to make a dramatic change in one direction or the other. The status quo is, in my humble opinion, off the table. We are either going to go sharply one way or sharply the other way. And I think that in terms of commitment, I believe it's everybody's responsibility to ask what the right thing to do is and to really speak out on it. This is the sticking point. And so I think the people on this call have amazing voice. I'm not sure about how the organizations work. I'm truly not, but I know how human beings work, and I know what community leaders are, and I know who people look to. And the health community has immense resonance around this country.
So we appreciate the work you're doing on the task force. We hope that you'll take to heart our concerns about the issue of really using the task force to move us quickly away from a fossil fuel economy, particularly to really focus on the harms that are happening now in communities that are, plagued by oil wells and oil extraction and oil refineries. And also the other side of that is to really make sure that the task force addresses the critical importance of building a community-based, community health, public health infrastructure, not just for contact tracing, but also to build climate resilience and to link that with jobs in weatherization and retrofitting and clean energy. And I think that's really sort of the thrust of what we want to say, is that for us, the climate crisis is an existential threat, not in the future, but right now in the most impacted communities. And we think it's so important that that health be just as important a consideration, not from the perspective of COVID, but from the perspective of the climate crisis in the work of the task force, and making sure that we come out of this with a stronger basis for healthy communities, because we can't have a strong economy without healthy communities at the core. I know you know that, but.
And to be fair, Governor Newsom really knows that. I mean, he said from the beginning, we have to put health first. And I think he's been very consistent in doing that. This is a tough crisis, but I think he's been very consistent about doing that. And that is the lens through which he's been making his decisions. And I think that that's 100% appropriate. But let me say one other thing. I have been sitting here listening to what you've said. I have also been writing down to myself specific practical things that we can do in the context of this task force in order to live up to what you're saying. Because I can see there's some things that we can do more, and some ideas that you've generated that I think we can do to actually follow through on the last thing that you said in terms of jobs.
We would be, I know that you're time limited, and we appreciate very much that you've taken this time to talk with us. We would be absolutely delighted to continue this conversation. We have a lot more specific you know, ideas about the sort of conceptual framework that we've laid out. We'd love to see more opportunity for people like us to engage and know what the task force is really doing. There hasn't been a lot of transparency.
I actually, you know, I am pushing for as much transparency as possible. You know, I believe that, and I think that, to me, the success of this task force will be actually getting specific things done like you were describing, and also telling people about it so people understand what we're doing. And
and help shape what you're doing.
Yes. As I said, it's a conversation. That's what I said I was up for. That is what I'm always up for. And I want it to be two-way, and it has been two-way, to be fair.
I think we're at time. I'm happy to keep talking if you have more time. We have a lot of questions, so you tell me.
I have got to go because I actually have a task force conference call to get on.
Tom, we're getting texted from your team saying you got to get off. So thank you. They're on to you. Yeah. But thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much. I love doing this. I love hearing ideas from people and hearing what they think we should be doing, what we could be doing better, what we're not including. So thank you very much. This has been fantastic.
Great. Thank you, Linda, to you too.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
So we'll share out a recording with everybody who registered if you want to share it even more widely. So thanks for joining us.
And for Climate Health Now members or people who are interested in becoming members, we are going to pivot directly into our monthly call. So if that is something you're planning to join, please just stay on the line. We are, for people who are new to Climate Health Now or potentially interested, we are medical and public health professionals and students who are working to leverage our voices in the climate health crisis. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, we're going to have a half-hour to 45-minute call right now. So just stay on. And thank you again to everyone who joined. I think we'll give people a few minutes just to take a break, and then we'll start up.
We could come back at 9:20 for Climate Health Now monthly meeting.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you.